Yeah, but what if we're the only ones? What if there's no
No,
survivors?
there's survivors. It's a big city. There has to be.
And don't make my mistake. If you see one of those things, uniform or not, you do not hesitate. You take it out. Or you run.
Resident Evil 2 Remake is a survival horror game released in 2019 and developed by Capcom. It is a remake of the original Resident Evil 2 that was released in 1998. Fans had been clamouring for a remake of Resident Evil 2 ever since the GameCube's frankly outstanding remake of the first Resident Evil back in 2002. However, at the time, Capcom were far too busy with other projects like the upcoming Resident Evil 4 to really pour too many resources into a potential remake of the second game. In 2015, however, Capcom released a short video featuring Resident Evil 2 Remake's producer, where he famously stated that, "We do it." We do it, of course, referring to them developing a remake of Resident Evil 2. For the next 3 years, news about the game would be practically non-existent, with many fans, including myself, believing that the game was in development hell. However, during Sony's E3 conference that year, a conference where this was a thing apparently,
Just keep moving, don't make eye contact.
Capcom finally revealed the first trailer for Resident Evil 2 Remake, and it looked absolutely incredible. Some fans were understandably upset that the game had decided to move away from the tank controls and static camera angles featured in the original Resident Evil 2, but nevertheless, most people were still incredibly hyped to play the final release of the game, myself included. A few weeks before the game's final release, a demo was made available to download on all platforms, which included the opening section of the game. The demo was timed, however, with it only being playable for 30 minutes. The demo may have been brief, but it was enough to reassure most fans that the game was turning out well, and more importantly, was sticking to its survival horror roots, instead of going down the action route like many of the later entries in the series. Resident Evil 2 Remake was released in January of 2019 to overwhelmingly positive reviews, with many critics finding the game to be genuinely terrifying. Praise was also given to the game's creepy setting, enjoyable combat, and clever level design. It's been 2 years since Resident Evil 2 Remake's release, and only now am I making a review on the game. That's because I struggled for a long time with how to accurately convey how I feel about this game. Make no mistake about it, Resident Evil 2 Remake is the greatest survival horror game ever made, and one of the greatest games of all time as far as I'm concerned. But trying to explain to people how I came to that conclusion might be a complicated process. With all that said, however, I'm willing to give it a shot. Before I begin this review, I would like to give some brief recommendations. Firstly, please do not purchase any of the game's unlockable weapons from the PlayStation or Xbox stores. Doing so will completely unbalance the game, to the point where you'll barely break a sweat while playing. Not to mention you'll probably be bored shitless the entire time. Secondly, if you are new to survival horror games, by all means play on assist mode during your first playthrough, but I would highly recommend you consider upping the difficulty to hardcore during all subsequent runs. Hardcore is how this game was meant to be played, and is a genuine challenge, even if you are a seasoned RE player. On hardcore mode, you need to find ink ribbons to save your progress, which adds to the game's tension significantly. There are also far less healing items and ammo boxes littered around the police station, which means strict resource management becomes absolutely key to survival. With all that out of the way, the first big decision you'll be faced with when starting the game is whether you want to play as Leon or Claire. For the purposes of this review, I chose to play the Leon A, Claire B scenarios, but there's no wrong or right order to play the game in. The Resident Evil 2 remake begins a little differently to the original. For one thing, we actually get to see how the truck driver from the beginning of the game gets bit.
What do I do? What am I gonna do?
This is followed by a whole new playable sequence where Leon has to explore a seemingly abandoned gas station. Right off the bat, one of the first things you'll notice about the RE2 remake is its outstanding use of lighting. Most areas in the game feature very dim lighting, which creates this incredibly eerie atmosphere where you are never quite sure what's around the next corner. Thankfully, both Leon and Claire have flashlights to navigate the darker environments, but it still doesn't reduce the fear and paranoia you'll feel exploring these areas. While exploring the gas station, Leon finds a police officer trying to restrain an uncooperative man. Thankfully, being a police officer in Raccoon City means that we get to take down criminals the American way.
Freeze! I'll shoot! Son of a bitch.
Leon somehow manages to avoid the other zombies in the area and escapes from the gas station, only to bump into Claire outside. Leon can't be sure that Claire isn't also a zombie, but she's got a nice face, so he's willing to take the risk.
Get down!
Leon and Claire escape in a nearby police car and make their way to Raccoon City, where they can finally be free of all these gosh darn zombies. On the way, Leon and Claire have a brief conversation where we learn that Claire is looking for her brother, Chris Redfield, star of the first game. We also learn that Leon is a police officer, and today was supposed to be his first day on the force, which has to make him the single unluckiest cop in history. Anyways, Leon and Claire eventually make it to Raccoon City, but unfortunately, things don't seem much better here. The whole city appears empty and lifeless. That is, until Claire spots even more of our undead friends in the streets. To make matters worse, the truck driver from earlier shows up right behind Leon and Claire, before falling asleep at the wheel, the incompetent fool. The truck crashes into their car, forcing Leon and Claire to escape the vehicle before it explodes. Now Claire and Leon find themselves separated by debris, but promise each other that they'll meet up once they reach the police station. Your next objective is to reach the police station in one piece, which actually isn't as challenging as it was in the original, mainly due to the streets being much wider in the remake, making avoiding the zombies a breeze. Still managed to get bit during this playthrough though. Upon reaching the station, Leon is dismayed to find the place more or less abandoned. That is, until he checks a nearby computer and finds another officer begging for help. Leon sets out to find the officer, and thankfully, he shows up just in time to save him.
I got you. Give me your other hand.
Well, save half of them at least. The area is then bombarded from all sides with zombies. It's an incredibly tense sequence, especially given the fact that there isn't nearly enough ammo to take all these guys down, and on top of that, healing supplies are practically non-existent. If you manage to escape the area, however, you'll be greeted by fellow police officer Marvin Branagh. Marvin's characterization in the remake is fantastic. In the original RE2, he was...
Who are you? Oh, you must be the new guy. Leon. Sorry, but it looks like your party has been cancelled.
But in the remake, he is a wonderfully developed character, even though he's only on screen for a very short time. He's courageous and helpful, and even faces his impending doom with a brave face, although it's quite obvious that he's terrified of eventually turning into a zombie. Marvin's presence during the first few hours of the game is very welcome, especially with how intimidating and terrifying the Raccoon City Police Department still feels at this point in the campaign. Eventually, Leon begins to explore the rest of the police station, and it is here where the game world begins to drastically open up, to the point where it feels like you're almost playing a Metroidvania game. Of course, open map design has always been a staple of early Resident Evil games, but I don't think it's ever been done as well as it has in the Resident Evil 2 remake. While the overall map design is very similar to what was seen in the original game, everything just flows better in the remake. Rooms connect together in a sensible manner, and everything is laid out in a way that makes getting from point A to B feel snappier and less time wasting. Your main objective during this section of the game is to find a safe route out of the police station. You do this by exploring the station thoroughly and solving some basic but enjoyable logic puzzles. Puzzles have taken a back seat in most Resident Evil games released during the last decade, which is why I was happy to see them be so prominent in the Resident Evil 2 remake. That doesn't mean they're outstanding puzzles by any means, but they serve as a nice change of pace from all the action and exploration found during the rest of the game. Of course, a Resident Evil game is nothing without a large roster of terrifying creatures, and RE2 Remake is no slouch in this department either. As always, there's your basic zombie enemy type. Personally, I had begun to feel like zombies had had their time, and that it was time for horror media to stop relying on them so heavily. Thankfully, RE2 Remake has made me a believer in zombies again, because they are genuinely terrifying in the remake. This is mostly down to their sheer unpredictability. Just like my parole officer, these guys have an awful habit of not staying down, even after you've pumped a dozen pistol rounds into them. Sometimes it might take 6 rounds to the head to drop a zombie. Other times their head might explode after a single shot. There's an element of RNG to how many bullets it might take to kill a zombie, which some players might find unfair or even a little cheap. But it's all done in the name of making these guys even more of a threat than ever. Because you'll never know how many bullets it may take to kill a zombie, you always have to weigh up whether it's worth using your limited ammunition at all, or whether you'd be better off simply running past them. It keeps you on your toes and thinking at all times. Of course, zombies aren't the only enemy type you'll be facing. I mean, what would a Resident Evil 2 remake be without lickers? Honestly, I always felt like the licker enemies from the original Resident Evil 2 were something of a disappointment. I didn't find their design scary, and as long as I had the shotgun handy, fighting them wasn't much of a challenge either. But oh boy, does the remake ever make good on the promise of these guys.
What in God's name?
The lickers in the RE2 remake are now a lot faster, much more aggressive, and can ambush you from practically any direction. It's not always possible to simply run past them either, as they are much faster than you and will eventually catch you. It can also take a ridiculous amount of ammo to kill the damn things. Since lickers are blind and navigate using sound, your best bet is to always try and sneak past them. But let me tell you, very few things in this world are as nerve-wracking as sneaking past a licker who is only mere inches away from you. But of course, there is one enemy in this game whose name strikes fear into all players. One enemy who single-handedly transforms Resident Evil 2 Remake from being an occasionally frightening game to one of the scariest survival horror video games ever made. The dogs. Just kidding, it's this guy. This is Mr. X, and he completely flips the game on its head when he appears. For one thing, you can't kill this guy, regardless of how many bullets you pump into him. You might be able to drop him to his knees for a short time, but he will always get back up again a few moments later. Mr. X stalks you throughout practically the entire building, and there are very few places where you are safe to catch your breath, outside of save rooms obviously. It can be genuinely unnerving when you are just trying to solve a puzzle and you can hear him stomping about near your location. Mr. X always seems to show up at just the wrong moment, which can occasionally lead to some frustration. Okay, time to get the hell out of here. Oh, for Christ's sake, get off me, dickhead. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Oh shit! However, by using your wits, it's usually not that difficult to evade him. Mr. X is both a blessing and a curse to the Resident Evil 2 remake. On one hand, I love his inclusion in the game. He functions almost like the Nemesis from Resident Evil 3, a relentless killing machine who won't ever stop pursuing you. He is genuinely intimidating, and for a while I even wanted to stop playing the game entirely, because of the anxiety I felt simply knowing this monstrosity was out there somewhere looking for me. He just never lets up, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never lose the guy. And trust me, I'm very good at losing guys. Mr. X's inclusion in the RE2 remake totally transformed the way I played the game in a meaningful way, and for that reason, his presence in the game is welcome. On the other hand, however, I've also seen many people just outright refuse to play the Resident Evil 2 remake because of Mr. X, and that is unfortunate, because I genuinely believe that if those people were able to get over their fear of playing the game, they would have a fantastic experience with the RE2 remake. Of course, Mr. X isn't the only big brute you'll have to contend with while playing the game, which leads us to the boss fights. I'm not going to spoil most of them here, but I will say that practically all of them are a massive step up in quality from the PS1 game. The original Resident Evil 2's stiff tank controls and awkward camera made fighting the game's bosses a nightmare at times, but thankfully that isn't the case in the remake. Being able to now do something as simple as shooting while moving at the same time makes all the difference in the world. The bosses are more well balanced than they were in the original, and it's actually feasible to come away from most of these fights without taking any damage at all. Throughout the game, both Leon and Claire will befriend a few memorable characters. A third of the way through his campaign, Leon runs into Ada Wong, aka one of the best characters in the entire series. Ada is a complete badass in the RE2 remake, and this is arguably her best incarnation yet. She's cool, funny, and somewhat mysterious. Her and Leon's blossoming romance in the game feels very well developed, and by the end of the game, you fully buy that these two people have fallen in love. You even get to play as Ada in a short sequence that sees you using a special gadget that allows Ada to manipulate various mechanisms throughout the sewers. Good stuff. Without spoiling too much else, completing Leon's campaign will take most people between 7 to 10 hours during their first playthrough. That might seem a little short, but it's a really well paced 7 to 10 hours that also encourages repeat playthroughs to better your ranking. Of course though, completing Leon's campaign is only half of the story, and to get the true ending, we still need to play through the game as my favourite character in the series, Claire Redfield. Claire's path through the Raccoon City Police Department is a little different from Leon's. She arrives at the police station much later than Leon, and enters the building through a rear entrance. Claire plays very similarly to Leon, but there are a few key differences. For one thing, Claire will find and use entirely different weapons to Leon. Whereas Leon finds a shotgun in the RPD's weapon locker, Claire finds a grenade launcher. I suppose I should briefly touch on the weapons featured in the Resident Evil 2 remake. In short, they all feel satisfying as hell to use. Blowing a zombie's head off with a shotgun never gets old. I mean it never gets old. Get the fuck off! The grenade launcher is also an absolute joy to use, and I never tired of setting foes on fire. Oddly enough though, I don't think there are any explosive rounds for the grenade launcher in the remake. I certainly didn't find any if there were. But my favourite weapon in the game is probably the spark shot, which is a electrifying good time. Laugh. Defense weapons also make a return in RE2 Remake, and they basically work exactly the way they did back in the original Resident Evil Remake. If you are holding on to one of these defense items when a monster grabs you, you can quickly press the L1 button to use the item and save yourself from taking damage. However, if you'd like to hold on to the defense item until later, you can instead choose to take some damage in return for being able to keep your defense item. This feature adds a nice little bit of risk versus reward to the gameplay, and is all the better for it. Unfortunately, Claire's campaign is still mostly the same as Leon's. You still have to unlock the passage out of the station, you still have to find the same keys to unlock the same doors, and you even have to complete many of the same puzzles. However, at the very least, some effort was made in differentiating the puzzles from one campaign to the other. For example, in Leon's campaign, you need to find these statues and enter the right combination on the dial to unlock a special coin. The solution for this puzzle is essentially given to you in a notebook you find early in the game. However, in Claire's campaign, while you do still find the notebook, some pages have been torn out, meaning that you need to find some other way of discovering the code. My favourite puzzle in the game is probably this one, involving chess pieces. In Leon's campaign, the answer is fairly straightforward, but in Claire's story it becomes a lot more complex. I appreciated little touches like that. A lot of people had mixed feelings towards the remake's soundtrack, or lack thereof. You see, the original Resident Evil 2 has a very memorable score. It's not the best music ever or anything like that, but it fit the world of Resident Evil 2 perfectly. The remake essentially removes most of this music and replaces it with ambient noise. There is still music, but it's mostly reserved for boss fights or bombastic set pieces. Even the iconic save theme only plays the first time you enter a safe room for a measly 30 seconds. At first I wasn't really on board with the decision to strip away most of the original game's music, but the more I thought about it, the more I realised it was the right move to make. Sound plays a more pivotal role in the Resident Evil 2 remake than it probably ever has before. For example, hearing Mr. X's footsteps is vital for getting a basic idea of where he might currently be searching. If you played the game's original score over those footsteps, well, this happens. On top of that, lickers tend to hide out of sight a lot more than they did in the original, so listening out for their telltale breathing becomes a lot more important. Of course, you can't talk about a game's sound without also mentioning the voice acting, and for the most part, Resident Evil 2's voice acting is a massive improvement over the original.
Oh no. Sherry? Claire? Sherry, are you alright? What are you doing? I'm here to help.
Sherry's been implanted. She can't be saved.
Are you fucking kidding me? You're her mother. Get in here!
Now don't get me wrong, I love Alison Court and Paul Haddad, may he rest in peace, but at the end of the day, they were very much from the PS1 school of voice acting, and the PS1 wasn't exactly the best time for voice acting in video games.
If you find them here we go, there we go, alright. If you find them cheeky birds, please use these wings.
The new voice cast, however, sound a lot more natural and believable, especially Claire. Speaking of Claire, I love her characterization in the remake. She is a complete badass and an absolute joy to watch on screen.
Let me go! I'll get you, you fucker!
Moreover, The mother-daughter-like relationship she develops with Sherry throughout the course of the game got me more than a little emotional a few times.
Your jacket's so warm.
My brother gave it to me. You know it's supposed to be lucky?
I don't know what I'd do without you.
Are you kidding me? You were doing just fine without me, so I came along and got you all sorts of trouble.
Speaking of Sherry Birkin, she is also playable during a short sequence in a brand new environment, the Raccoon City Orphanage. During this sequence, Sherry is completely unarmed and has to hide from her pursuer. It's genuinely one of the tensest sequences in the game, and if I'm not mistaken, it's the first time the series has used an actual living human being as an enemy, which I thought was a cool touch. Speaking of brand new locations, the sewers and laboratory areas from the original RE2 have been more or less completely redesigned here, and it's a massive improvement. I always felt like the level design in the original game started to become progressively lazier and linear once you hit the sewer area, but that isn't the case in the remake. The sewers here are massive and feature brand new puzzles and even a new enemy type never seen in the series before. If you thought the level design in the original Resident Evil 2 began to feel a little uninspired around the halfway point, you'll be happy to hear that the remake is a massive improvement in that area. I also can't talk about a Resident Evil game without quickly mentioning the blood and gore. And good lord, does this game ever have blood and gore.
Hey, you need this! Just get me the fuck out of here!
Oh my god.
Without sounding too much like a sicko, I'm glad Capcom have begun to really push the level of violence in video games to new extremes. In my opinion, the violence in a lot of the more recent Resident Evil games, like 5, 6, and especially Revelations, seemed pretty tame in comparison to earlier games in the series. But thankfully, games like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake are probably two of the most deliciously violent games ever made. Once you have completed both Leon and Claire's campaigns, you unlock a few neat little extras, including the excellent The Fourth Survivor mode, which sees you playing as the legendary Hunk, trying to escape the Raccoon City Police Department in one piece. This mode is an enjoyable little bonus, but be warned, it's incredibly challenging and will probably take most players a few dozen attempts before they are able to complete it. Honestly, I could talk about the Resident Evil 2 remake for hours. It's easily in my top 3 games of last generation. I've played very few games in my time that have been this immaculately designed. Practically every aspect of the game, from its intelligent puzzles and clever level design to its thoughtful combat and brisk pacing, has been designed with the love and care you'd expect from this development team. It is clear that the people who worked on this game loved the original Resident Evil 2 just as much as the fans, and they did an absolutely fantastic job with the remake. I know some people find playing horror games difficult, but I would urge those people to try and overcome their fears for this game. It's worth it. Even if they have to play the game in broad daylight with other people around them, just give the Resident Evil 2 remake a chance. I genuinely believe it's not only the greatest survival horror game ever made, but also one of the greatest games ever made, period. Hey guys, I just want to thank you for checking out my video. This one took quite a while to make, so if you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a like. And if you're into horror games or survival horror games, please consider subscribing to my channel, because that's the kind of stuff I specialize in. So hopefully I'll see you guys again soon, and thank you for watching. Peace.